I would now like to introduce today's moderators and presenters. Michael Jansen, Chief Research Officer, guides the practice's research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Abhishek Sharma, partner, provides delivery leadership on all of Everest Group pricing assurance engagements, assisting clients on topics related to price and contract benchmarking, strategic engagement reviews, and sourcing cost rationalization. Amy Fong, Vice President, leads the practice's strategic outsourcing and vendor management membership, as well as custom projects to support procurement and supplier management. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Michael. Take it away, Michael.
All right, thank you, Lucy. And welcome, everybody. I'm going to set the context for what we're seeing in the marketplace before we jump into the actual contracting and details. So, you know, the COVID story so far has been one of, you know, kind of, it's an evolving situation. The first thing we encountered after the shock and awe of, hey, it's going to be a different world out there was the remote delivery. And for the most part, talking to clients, both on the buyer and the service provider side, we basically got that figured out. There's still some, you know, challenges to be dealt with, and we've done some recent studies on what folks are facing with. But for the most part, I would have to say that we've got that the initial shock and awe is now turned into, hey, we're running the business again. But at the same time, all the things that we had kind of buried 2 or 3 levels down in the operating models, those have all been exposed. And so people are much more aware of the challenges of different delivery models and the sacrifices that people have had to make, or the compromises we've made in service levels. But that got exposed at the board level. In addition, there's many enterprises, and I say many because not all, but many enterprises have now started to get past the initial shock and awe and now moved into a kind of a recessionary mindset. And so now it's starting to take the reality of, hey, this is the way things are going to be for the ongoing foreseeable future, and we need to think about how we're going to operate and how do we to normalizing our revenues and our expenses again, and potentially having to cut cost. I say that with some industries, some are actually busier than they have ever been in the past, and so some others are not impacted, but many are. I'd say the majority are. And as we look at that, the C-suite is looking to say, hey, now what are the structural changes we need to make to our business? So the digital move to digital, which has been happening, you know, for the past decade or so, it's been accelerating. And in many cases, I was just on a call a few minutes ago with a global business services head, and they were talking about how they were so busy making the changes they wish they'd made before. So as we look at what that means for folks on this call, you know, the budget cliff is here, and you know, it's probably the fastest and the steepest that I've ever seen in my career in terms of, hey, we need to make those changes now. Smart leaders are using this crisis, and we've always had this saying that says never let a good crisis go without change, and ripping off the band-aid is kind of the mode of operandi we're in right now. So as I mentioned before, the investments in digital and business model changes and modernization are increasing rapidly. Everything's on the table. And finally, from our perspective, most of these changes are going to be measured in months, not, you know, maybe a quarter or so, but not quarters in years. So the expectation for making these things happen is very, very quick. So Amy, you're looking at the different stages here.
Yes, and we've been speaking with a large variety of companies over the last couple of months as we went through this, and we've really seen the progression through these stages. We spent a lot of time, as Michael said up front, in what we call the work from home scramble. Actually only lasted a couple weeks, but it felt like a lot longer for getting service centers up, getting employees technology-wise and policy-wise ready to work from home. And then moving into resource continuity planning, there was a lot of concern back then that you know, a large scale illness in the workforce might take down service centers, things like that. We haven't seen that yet. I don't know that we're completely out of the clear, but we didn't necessarily hit that productivity gap. In fact, many people would argue that productivity has been the same or higher with work from home. I hear both sides of that coin, but still seems to be seems like we didn't have a large scale medical absenteeism issue. So now as we move to what we were thinking of as kind of stage 3 and 4, we really see organizations focused on two things, and we realize these aren't sequential, they're happening in parallel. So one is the cost takeout scramble that Michael mentioned. There is a budget cliff for a lot of organizations. Even those that are in good shape realize the recession is here or may get worse, and there's quite a bit of uncertainty. So we're looking at where we can cut back. Procurement organizations specifically are charged with a lot right now and finding opportunities to cut costs, bring savings to the table in a way that's win-win. On another note, we're also looking at what does the next normal look like. So as we go back to the office, as things open up or partially open up, we all acknowledge that it's not going to be the same as it was, and that's going to require a whole new set of questions, new set of terms, new set of arrangements with service providers. So we'll get into that a little bit later on in this session. For now, we're going to focus on the cost takeout piece of this, and really where we see some of the trade-offs and the biggest opportunities.
All right, so speaking of trade-offs here, we talked about all options being on the table. And so in some organizations, that's going to be more outsourcing. For some, it's going to be less outsourcing, depending on the situation. Portfolio consolidation versus portfolio expansion. And so, implied in what we've been hearing is been the general overall response has been that their service providers have been heroes of the day. Most people that we have talked to around outsourcing deals, both buyer and supplier, the initial conversation was to let's get things working right again. Let's not talk about contract renegotiations. Let's not talk about who's responsible. No finger pointing. For the most part, it was be responsive, get the job done, do whatever it takes. But at the same time, some people were better at that than others, and so I think there's going to be some opportunities for those suppliers that were well equipped to handle it, to see their portfolio and clients looking to use them more. The other conversation is going to become on the onshore versus offshore. I think this debate is going to take a little longer to play out, but there's lots of other trends that are in play here, not just the pandemic that we have to worry about here, but the onshore offshore is involving tariffs and regulations and geopolitical implications is still in play. And then finally, for some, the expansion of the GBS or not. Some folks are going to be looking at it and saying, hey, I can turn my shared services into a monetization opportunity. So maybe it was a cost center for me before, but maybe I can find a better home for that in an outsourcing situation. And so they'll look to sell their GBS centers or shared services centers as they have done in the past. So all those things are going to be in play, all those options. When we look at the data that we've just recently collected in the last few weeks here, you'll see that it's not just our words here, but on the next chart, you can see where we ask the question about where they expect to have significant effort in the next few weeks as we go into the next normal. And you'll see that the workforce flexibility is the number one thing where folks are putting significant effort in there. So whether it's work from home, I think Amy and I both mentioned that people are kind of, they are working from home. That's the truth. But now they have to rethink the implications of that, the culture, the management practices, what are the policies, how do they measure productivity? All those things are now starting to come in play, and we got some data on that we'll be showcasing in the next few days as well. But number two on there is reining in operational cost, and so that is not going to go away. It's something that people have to look at, and I think people are now said, hey, we got past the crisis part of this situation, and now we're into the business going forward, and what do we need to do there? There is still a propensity to look at what do we learn about the risk in planning. So I think there will be more focus on that, though that will tend to fade pretty quick in lieu of the cost takeout. And then you see they're cutting out external spend as well. So lots of different things to think about here. What I wanted to do is turn it over to Abhishek. And Abhishek, you're going to talk about what kind of the meat of this webinar is, and actually take us through some of the elements of the cost cutting and outsourcing context as well.
Absolutely, thanks, Michael. So, given the context, obviously it's clear that cost takeout is pretty much top of mind. So, what are we going to discuss today in the next 50 minutes or so? Point number one: are enterprises overpaying for their services, for the outsourced services, despite significant cost pressures? Point number two: given that they are, what, when, and how much to negotiate? That's a critical question, because clearly, as we'll describe in a few minutes, a one-size-fits-all approach won't really work. And finally, is it about one big swoop on a pricing haircut, or what about some win-win levers which can really lead to some sustainable cost savings for the enterprise without really impacting the relationship too much, right? So these are some of the elements which we're going to cover. The sources which we'll use which have been used for the insights in this webinar are obviously our recent deal advisory, sole source, competitive experience, any mid-tenure contract renegotiations we've been part of, and most importantly, as this is a rapidly evolving space, recent discussions with enterprise executives on the space. So look forward to some interesting conversations, and of course your questions towards the end.
Yeah. So our intent is not to have you go out and beat up on your service provider for your enterprise. Our intent here in this is to provide you those levers that do create the win-win situation. So we believe that if you just go out and impact rates only, that's not the optimal way to approach this. We believe that there's going to be a combination of things that we'll illustrate here to approach this in a way that is not only lowers the cost structure, but also allows service providers to maintain their viability as well. So keep that in mind as we go through here. So our discussion points for today are where are the opportunities, and then we'll get into some of the structural changes and how do you get there, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So Amy, you're going to talk to us about the first slide here.
Yeah, where to start? So, when we look at enterprise portfolios, and we're lucky to have Abhishek on the line today, he is definitely the expert on this topic and has a lot of really good insights, all of which come from working with clients, working in the industry and looking at different portfolios and performing contract reviews, pricing reviews, benchmarking projects to look at where the issues are and where the drivers of cost leakage or value leakage are. And there's some common themes that we can start with. So things like poor offshore leverage or overskilling roles, having descriptions for roles that are at priced higher than what you really need to be paying, high bill rates for certain skill premiums, not having your continuous improvement expectations clearly built in a equal and reasonable way, as well as having terms that are just more favorable to the provider and not having technology as well. And obviously, digitization is very important right now, digital transformation, and our service providers should be partnering with us. So all of these kind of compound to provide a lot of value leakage in the portfolio. We're going to deep dive into some of those specific areas today. Let Abhishek or let Michael kind of set up the first poll, and then Abhishek's going to drive into all of these areas.
Okay, so we're going to open up. We want to hear from you. Want to hear what your thoughts are on our poll question number one, which is where do you think the three biggest opportunities are for your organization? So is it looking at high bill rates and overskilling? Is it the poor offshore leverage? Is there inadequate continuous improvements? Is there something around the inflation or currency or embedded terms in the contract? Or maybe it's an obsolete solution or technology. So the poll is open, and let's see if we can get people to jump in there and answer that. Okay, I see one clear leader. Nope, there's two that are pretty much neck and neck. Okay, we'll leave it open for another 5 seconds here. All right, Peter, why don't you bring it to close? Okay, so number one is the continuous improvement expectation. So I think that's really a combination of a number of different things here, and fits really nicely into the conversation that Abhishek's about to talk about on the next page here. But you know, it's easy to get into when you create a deal. It's easy to get into the world of, hey, this is going to be a better price than what we're paying for. Everybody gets enamored with the new gizmos or technology that are going to be implemented. And so I get my 10-15% upfront reduction. I get my new gizmos and technology. But people often will forget that these deals are constructed over 5 or 7 years, and that's where the opportunity becomes. If you're 3 to 4 years into a deal, the world changes and the opportunity is there. So you see that kind of point being illustrated both by the number 1 and number 2 conversations of obsolete solutions and continuous improvement. So I think those are what I would have expected. And then some conversation around, hey, maybe we can do more with the offshore. So that's your views. Thank you for that. And then Abhishek, why don't you start us down the conversation?
Absolutely, thanks, Michael. And those poll results, interestingly align with perhaps what we had in mind. It's no surprise that automation, technology, continuous improvement is going to be the way to go. Because there's clearly some way on a lot of legacy contracts where progress can be made. So in terms of just doing a double click on where really the cost takeout opportunity lies. Now, one of the common starting points on price reduction discussions we've noticed in the past few weeks is a straight request for a discount, right? It could be 10%, 15%, in some cases going up to 20%. Often using elements like a difference in margins, that, hey, you can afford to give this much. There's a lot of rationale being put around it, but effectively it's a straight request for a base price haircut. Now, while that may work in some cases, clearly it definitely will not work for all. That's our perspective, and let me explain why. Where an enterprise can sustainably get to, right, in this cost takeout initiative or approach, is also a function of what the starting point is, which is why a well thought out approach tends to yield better results. For example, a deal where the provider's fee is already 25% above market median has much more savings potential. And then, I'd argue, why just stop at 15%? Because clearly, even without anything, there's this scope to reduce it by 25%, right? So that starting point is very critical to know. Alternately, there could be a deal where the current fee is really near to market minimum. So already either the provider is super efficient, or the deal level margin is less. So asking an additional 20% over and above that definitely is going to be counterproductive, because in one way or the other, either the service will suffer or the relationship will suffer. So that's why it has a level of prioritization is ultra critical. Finally, any fee reduction should be anchored around win-win themes, which we're going to speak to you about in a few minutes, which potentially also help the provider cut down delivery costs, because the whole pandemic-initiated cost pressures are not singular to enterprises. Even providers are facing those pressures. There's been delivery pressure. Clients may be cutting down on discretionary spending. So because all of us are in it together, it's important to look at the broader themes rather than just bombard the service provider with a cost takeout request. So if we move to the next page, I'll just, this graphic effectively shows what we believe are the major levers which can lead to a sustainable cost reduction. So no surprises, the first one that you see on the left, right next to the blue bar, is the rate card and skill recalibration. Make no mistake, this is important. Many times there is a potential to tweak it forward, but at the same time, focusing singularly on just underlying unit rates or rate cards, even though it's very common, could just be the tip of the iceberg, right? So there's a whole lot which is being missed. So there's a number of additional win-win levers that can help reduce the cost for the enterprise, with much lower impact on service provider margins, right? So what this effectively means is that while the cost for the enterprise is being reduced, Simultaneously, the underlying cost base for the service provider is also being reduced, so that even though the revenue reduces, the cost base for the provider reduces as well. So again, it's not as bad as a straight haircut, right? Now, for a sustainable relationship, I guess this comprehensive view is needed to get the maximum dollar reduction, right? So we'll take you through some of these in detail. Let's start with the most common, right? In the IT infrastructure space, on the next page, yeah. So this is the simple unit price lever. We've taken an example of IT infrastructure because that has declined significantly in the past 2 years, and yet we still see many enterprises paying the same old high rates, right? The impact, in our view, actually gets amplified because IT infrastructure is a major spend area. So the scale factor makes the hit even more. So our recommendation in these cases would be for every enterprise to objectively review their IT infrastructure rates once every 24 to 30 months, in the steady state going forward. I guess at a bare minimum, it would be to take stock right now, given the immediate cost pressures. And I won't be surprised if, even if not all, majority of cases, it could be reduced, right? So again, while this was about base rates, actually the story doesn't end here, right? So this was an easy fix infrastructure. We've seen a great reduction in pricing. On the next page, we'll speak about another aspect which is related to base rates, but not actually the base rate. It's what we call the skill premiums. And that's an interesting phenomenon that we see on page 15. Yeah. So once a hot skill doesn't mean it is always a hot skill. Right? That's something which all of us should bear in mind. Now, the phenomena that I mentioned was what I like to call skill premium inertia, right? This is when a premium agreed at a certain point in time remains the same even if the market has changed, right? So something agreed, let's say in 2017 or 2018, when a certain premium, let's say for SAP S/4HANA was X, it just remains in place irrespective of how the market premiums for that skill have declined. So effectively, what that means is that while the market premiums have reduced, enterprises continue to pay a higher amount, and for whatever reason, no initiation from the service provider comes through. So the onus, honestly, is on the enterprise to constantly keep on recalibrating them, and the delta that has the movement for some of those skills in the past 2 years is not minuscule, right? Like some of the examples we've shared. 5 to 18%, especially where there's large volumes of resources working in today's time or any other time, is material enough to investigate. So again, it's ultra critical to maintain a look at these skill premiums through the contract.
So okay, Abhishek, I'm looking at one of the questions here in the chat here. It says, you're talking about further discount, which is higher than most BPO margins. This is simply not realistic. And I think I want to come back to that conversation. If you could go back, Peter, 2 slides. So we are not talking about just a conversation around rates. What we're saying here, there's a number of different things that have the combination effect of reducing the cost structure of the service provider by replacing labor with automation. That could be one of the examples. So if you think about this, it's 3 or 4 or 5 different combination of things that are going to make the difference, not just a pure focus in on just a price element only. Is that fair, Abhishek?
Yes, it is, Michael. Absolutely.
Okay. So just answering the question and making sure that we're not just focused solely on the rate. So let's go to open to another quick poll here and get your expectations. So what I want to emphasize here: what levels of effective rate or price change are you targeting? And I'm talking about at a structural basis here, not just looking at a rate element, but looking at all the things that go into to your deal. If you're talking to your service providers, where are you targeting? Which of these things? 0 to 3, 4 to 8, 9 to 13, 14 to 19, or some of you are really ambitious at 20 plus. All right, and I see the answers coming in here.
The question was, is that per year? Yeah, we're looking at annualized, right?
Yeah, we're looking at it. Well, we're looking at the initial conversation right now.
Initial.
Yeah, we're looking at the initial conversation from where you are at today to where you're going to be in the near term. Okay, we'll give it another 3 seconds. Okay, so this is pretty much right in the middle there. What you're going to see is the 4 to 8, the 9 to 13. So we'll call it an average of about 10%. If you did a weighted average across all across the board there. Some are being very ambitious at 20 plus, roughly 10% of you, and others are being very much more modest there. So really, if I take a weighted average, I would say this comes out to 10, 12% across the board, which is probably what I would expect. I mean, I think those are realistic. We know that there is a higher possibility with a structural changes, but those are things that that aren't going to happen overnight. They're going to be things you have to really think about, process reengineering, and some of the other elements that you're going to talk about here, Abhishek, as we go forward.
Yeah. Okay, so we talked about some of those win-win themes, right? So now we'll obviously come to them in a while. One of the things which we're seeing these days is like a cost of living adjustment waiver. Right? It's important to put in place. It's important to understand, right, that a cost of living adjustment is something, while it looks simplistic, many times in 3 or 4 conversations precisely, right, and that's been consistent over the past more than 2 years now, right? It appears to be a pain point for enterprises, right? So one of the levers, which especially if the cost of living current terms are fairly generous, that would be one of the lever to negotiate or discuss between both parties to say that, hey, can a waiver for a couple of years be made in place just to soften some of the blow on cost pressures. Now, by itself, it may not be enough to get to whatever the 10 to 12% weighted average that we saw in the quick poll, but every bit counts, right? That's what we are. So the waiver is one part. Now, I think fundamentally, both parties also have to take a relook at some of the themes like, what's the correct index to be used? Is it a CPI? Is the Hewitt index? How do we ensure that it's fair for both parties? What's the formula being used? What's the calculation model, sensitivity? So again, a lot of these things, sometimes it's important to recalibrate because unlike many other factors, this tends to be cascading, right? So every year, if it's more skewed towards a higher number being hit to the enterprise, it just goes on increasing year on year. So again, that's something very important to bear in mind as and when we're discussing through some of the cost of living adjustment themes.
So Abhishek, this is one where when I was doing deals, building deals on the supply side, I was always amazed. I was the financial modeler early in my career, and I was always amazed that this was, lots of negotiation went on in terms of the solution. Lots of negotiation went into the service levels. Lots of negotiation went on around how much price reduction were initially going to be taken out. But this was one of those items that was usually on deep in the legal contract that many times, we'd put it in there and say, hey, we're never going to raise prices more than the inflation rate. And there would be a little model there. And it was amazing how many times people never even looked at that clause. And I was just always amazed that was, and when I did the modeling, it was the most important clause in the entire contract from a modeling standpoint. And because it changed, maybe not year 1 that much, but not year 2. But when you start getting into years 4, 5, and 6 of a contract, it has a exponential, multiplicative effect on the deal.
Yeah. The devil's in the detail, as they say. So, just to take a recent example, and this is actual, right? We saw one client overpaying by up to $1 million annually on a $50 million annual spend just due to a skewed COLA regime, right? So, while initially the numbers may look small over a cascaded or multiplicated format, it ends up being quite material. So totally agree.
Very deep in the contract, though.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think Abhishek's talked a little bit about some of the direct cost levers, and I hear some people saying, well, there's, only so far the margin is not that as big as the numbers that we're talking about here. I think it's really important to step back and look at, the bigger picture. And when we talk about win-win, what are the bigger cost impact levers that might be more indirect? So when we look at the left on this slide, we're talking, there's, kind of the direct cost levers, COLA impact, for example, like we just spoke about, technology skill, premium reduction, account management fees. You want to get all of those right? You don't want to be leaving money on the table. And I really believe if you're a procurement person or a vendor manager going into a negotiation, you need to be armed with all of the best information and the latest data to have a good negotiation and be successful. However, when you look at the bigger picture of the all-in total cost of ownership or total cost of delivery, there's really a lot of other indirect cost impact levers that can be modified or played with to get a win-win. So things like preferred spend portfolio access and your offshore level or leverage and levels of automation, the resource delivery model that Abhishek's going to talk about more, that can really shift the paradigm here and put some of these savings in, or the benefits, the cost benefits in for a longer term. So I'll turn it back over to Abhishek to get into some of these in more detail.
Yeah, let me, before you jump in there, Abhishek, there's a question here about currency rate and fluctuations, and I think that goes hand in hand with the COLA clause. It's a part of that. We're not trying to cover everything in this webinar, but to the person that asked the question about FX rate fluctuations, that is extremely important.
Definitely
it is. Okay. Right. So, speaking of win-win, right, one of the elements which often gets ignored, or in many cases, both sides may not be as open to start talking about it, but in our experience, we've seen that it could have a material impact. Now, we're talking about, service level targets and stringency. Right? From a business perspective, this could be sensitive. Nobody wants to see their service levels come down. But, we need to realize that there's nothing like a free lunch. Oftentimes during the initial stages of a deal or a relationship, right, a stringent set of SLAs may be needed, right, just to make sure that there's enough comfort, just to make sure that things go as planned and there's enough of a buffer so that there's no service deterioration. Right? Having said that, each stringent SLA target gets baked into the service provider's risk premiums, and there's no shame in that, right? But, the more stringency you ask for, the more the risk premium they have to bake in, the more resources they'll have to put in, etc. Over time, right, there could be a situation where maybe such stringent service levels are not needed. So, in good practice, some of these could be recalibrated to include new metrics, the change in stringency on some, or even retire some metrics. Now, as and when these things change, the underlying effort from the service provider could change as well. Right? So, and the differences, or related to the SLA stringency and the maximum ranges that we've shown here are not immaterial, right? So we've seen cases, in rare cases, actually, the fee profile change by as much as anywhere between 7, 8, 10% basis some of these changes, especially where at the starting point the SLAs were kept as super stringent. In some cases, technology also plays a role as things evolve, as things get much more automated. It can be negotiated that, hey, a highly automated process obviously does not need as much delta of an effort to have such high service levels. So it's very contextual. It's hard to generalize that, hey, this could get 7% versus 10%, but definitely the savings are material enough to have a very very prudent, very straightforward conversation between the two parties, right? So that's on service levels. Another theme that we discuss on the next page is around automation. Right? So this slide is not to debate whether it should be 20%, 25%, what's the standard, etc., because it's again very context dependent. What I'm going to talk about is the following. This is what we see in many contracts. Automation business case, check. Automation savings delivered as per the service provider, check. Clarity and transparency on how that has been factored in, neither here nor there. Major gap area. So in many contract relationships, we've seen a level of opacity in terms of what really the net impact has been due to ongoing and automation related productivity. So in our mind, it's fairly simple, right? The provider and the relationship should be structured, the governance should be structured in a way that the reporting, should be structured in a way that it showcases two things, right? What percentage of the reduction in terms of resources or dollar impact comes from what lever, right? What is due to the automation, what's due to standardization, what's due to centralization, process improvements. Make it very clear, and we've seen actually many providers do that, and it imparts so much of clarity in the enterprise's mind, and more often, and more importantly, it helps articulate where that value is coming from, right? And second, mention very clearly what's unconditionally committed, that hey, that's baked into our solution, and what is a bit of a subject to dependencies, right? So simple thing to measure. Oftentimes, if everything is bundled in, that hey, we work together to move the needle from this to that. Unless there's clarity, we've seen enterprises actually doubting a lot more than what actually could have been done. So net providers may be doing themselves a bit of a disservice by trying to bundle the impact, bundle the articulation of impact, right? So our view would be that as contracts get renegotiated, discussed, overhauled, this definitely should be the norm, and it'll again be a lever as more automation, potentially more technology is bundled in to have a win-win conversation. Okay, so we talked about a few levers. Some were direct, some were win-win. Obviously, we can't talk about each and every lever, but I'll just try and summarize, the clear prioritization. One, before embarking on an outsourced price recalibration, that's what we like to call it. I'll repeat myself. We believe it's critical to understand how the current fee stacks up, right? Because resources are limited. Prioritizing those scope areas with the maximum juice in them is going to be important. Going after a fee profile which is already much better than market ranges, can derail the relationship, service quality, and may not really lead to any impactful dollar reduction. Point number two, our view is that as a thumb rule, and we can never be 100% correct in this, legacy contracts tend to have more bloat in them, right? Just by the nature they've been structured. Things that have been signed more recently or heavily renegotiated more recently tend to have a less of a bloat. So if things have been going on without major renegotiations, there could be a larger degree of bloat potentially in those contracts. Finally, highly advisable to think beyond the unit prices or rate cards, right? Because an ostensibly competitive rate card may be hiding other inefficiencies. So look at it in totality. Don't just stop at the rate card, and have a more strategic, well thought out conversation.
Okay, so lots of moving parts here. We haven't attempted to touch on every one of them, but we wanted to give you a slice of what we see. What we'd also like to do is to offer a slice of our data. And so for those that are enterprises, this is going to be a complimentary offer, something that we would offer to any buyers of services. And what Abhishek's prepared to do and his team are to give you a slice from their 250 roles in 32 countries, and that's the macro database, but we're going to limit it here so that he can efficiently give feedback for anybody that's again on the enterprise side of what we call our complimentary price check. So if you're interested, Peter, if you'd open up the quick poll here about getting a slice of the data, a couple of functional roles, and from three different functional roles from 3 different countries. Let us know if you're interested in that, and absolutely want to help you in the discovery process. I don't want to say this is the end-all answer by looking at the rates, but it is an important part of the starting of the discussion, and then we think it's going to be a much more comprehensive answer. So again, we'll just leave it open here. If you're interested, click on it. Yes, let me know, and we'll get back with you after the webinar to help you get a slice of Abhishek's time and data. Okay, all right, leave it 2 more seconds here. Thank you, Peter. Okay, so we're going to move into our next section here, which is really optimization versus structural changes. And so who's got this one here? We got this is going to
This will be me.
yeah, Amy, you got this one. Sorry.
Yeah, so we're going to talk in a moment about more structural changes, but I think it's important to think about really these two different ways. We talked about a number of different levers, right? But you can optimize your costs, and then you can make modernization, structural changes that are going to significantly change your costs for the long term. And optimization, we've talked about a lot of things like rate benchmarking and rationalizing your portfolio. We didn't get too into, but that certainly falls into that category. Looking at your contract terms and right sizing. But the bigger changes tend to be around hyper productivity, automation, everything as a service, opportunities across different towers. And the traditional approach has been to execute these in sequence. Very few companies take on too much at a time, or all of these at a time. It tends to feel like too much. I think we're actually coming to a point where we talked early on about the acceleration of transformation and this push as we go into the next normal to get to make these big changes in a more simultaneous approach where we're trying to optimize and we're trying to modernize at the same time. So we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these different, what some of the modernization might look like. I'll let Abhishek talk about some of the structural changes that eventually lead to a bigger change in commercial competitiveness.
Sure. So enterprises looking for structural changes, just like Amy mentioned, could have multiple options, right? Some of which we will talk about briefly. So point number one, provider portfolio rationalization. Now, as relationships have grown, portfolios have grown, we've seen that they often include a large number of providers, right? So an overhaul of the number of those in the mix and the role which each provider plays is important and can actually help reduce total cost of ownership, either due to economies of scale, right, better pricing from a consolidated set, and also reduced internal overheads, because it's not just about how much enterprises are paying to service providers, it's also the internal overheads needed, governance costs to manage such a large set of providers, right? So that could be option number one. Pricing models, the best fit pricing models can often change over time depending on the business context, right? So both parties could explore mutually agreeable pricing models. And if, for example, if volumes have reduced drastically, there could even be a case to move back from, more sophisticated unit-based, output-based pricing back to input-based or FP-based pricing, right? As we say, there's no shame in moving from one model to the other. It's all contingent on the specific situation, right? So whatever fits best, I think that should be the approach. The third is around linking some fees to business results. Times are tough. Providers now need to almost consistently, right, put more skin in the game and have it as a de facto proposition, right? Many of them do. In many relationships, we have seen it. Now, this could be in the guise of a certain percentage linked to efficiency improvement, increase in UX impact, user experience impact, overall demand management reduction, which keeps overall costs down. Now, very contextual, it has to be decided, but something linked to a business result could be another structural change to drive the right kind of behaviors. Finally, this could also be a good time for technology solution reinvigoration. As one of the quick polls showed, that could be one of the major levers for cost impact. Now, we understand while investments will be hard to make, we also know from broader experience that in tough times, we've seen that many internal organization roadblocks, which often hamper such initiatives, tend to be relatively simpler to overcome, particularly because the cost takeout mandates become crystal clear and non-negotiable. So this could be a time to explore greater automation, technology leverage, with, of course, the right kind of financial engineering baked in.
All right, so how do we get there from there? How do we get there from here?
Yeah, so there's a number of different decisions to make right now as we're planning for what we call the next normal is in outsourced services. And we talked earlier about those stages. We're kind of through the first two stages, we think, in this crisis. And now we're looking in parallel at cost reduction, which or cost takeout, which certainly falls into the pricing and cost on this slide, but also all of these other components of the next normal. There's quite a few decisions we need to make. So when we are working with organizations, what we're seeing is really six areas that we need to be thinking about. One is the sourcing strategy and the provider portfolio. What is the structure? Do we diversify? Do we consolidate? You know, there's a lot of talk of, do we need to be in more countries than we were in previously? You know, city down plans didn't really work when we had something that hit every single city and every single country. Do we need more providers? Do we need fewer? Solution design is certainly going to be impacted when we look at the workforce strategy and workplace design changing. So we all know that there's going to be shifts potentially in work from home, whether that's in the next 6 months or in the next year or permanently. How does that affect our MSAs? How does that affect our location strategy, automation, other things? So the whole design of our solutions for a lot of us is under examination right now. And as we examine that, there's a lot of points that we made here today that really are up for discussion. It is a time of crisis for both the providers and for the buyers, but that doesn't mean that we need to go easy, and we need to, as a fiduciary responsibility, find win-win solutions that work for both sides, for parties, both sides. We've talked a lot about pricing and cost, and that certainly fits into the model. But other things that people have brought up as top priorities, in fact, when we put this in front of a round table of outsourced services buyers recently, the three things that really popped up as priorities were performance management and governance, and thinking about how that model needs to change, risk management, looking at our BCP plans, business continuity plans, tracking better, having plans that covered more possibilities, even those that I spoke with a company yesterday that said we had a brand new BCP plan. It was great. I said, did it cover pandemics? They're like, well, no, but at least it covered work from home. So we had some of the reaction steps already covered. But we really need to think about how much risk we want to mitigate. And then, of course, policy and contracting, whether it be internal or the policies that we're asking service providers to follow. So all in all, there's several different areas. We focused a lot here on the cost takeout, but when we look at that next normal, it's all very interconnected, that we may be shifting our models in significant ways while also trying to take out costs and take down the spend, and whether what is possibly going to be a longer term economic hardship. So I think when we think about what most enterprise sourcing portfolios are looking like right now, there's a lot of different value leakage that needs to be addressed. Things beyond what we talked about today: demand management, increasing self-service, eliminating simple things like overskilling of roles and supplier rationalization. But some of these are very significant. They all kind of fit together to build the next model for the next normal. Abhishek, why don't you take people through a couple of the things Michael put up earlier, the opportunity to get a price check from us. I would encourage everyone to do that. I think just doing one real quick, finger to the wind of how close your pricing is to market rates is a good starting point for this. Obviously, we've talked about a lot of things, and that doesn't encompass everything. But as we look at what Abhishek and his team do in the pricing assurance practice that we have, we've seen some really significant benefits from that. And I'm going to have him talk through just a couple examples of that.
Sure. Thanks, Amy. So, whatever we described till now, I just say it's steeped in reality. Right? right? As we mentioned, this is all from deal experience, either competitive, we're doing a renegotiation, benchmarking, live discussions with clients. So enterprise clients net have seen significant benefits in pretty short time frames from these recalibration efforts, right? And which is something which always makes these efforts self-funding, right? So for example, we recently supported a life sciences major on a sole source, relatively mid-sized proposal validation, right? Just to ensure that they're getting the right terms, price, performance. So within a span of about 3 weeks, the client was able to use market relevant facts to drive down the fee by an annualized $2.2 million, right? So this wasn't drive down just to hit a hammer, a very fact-based, optimized view on getting it right. So effectively, almost within a month, they get something like a 20x return on investment, right? Even if we count only 1 year's worth of savings. Right? In another example, on a pretty large portfolio of outsourced contact center services for a client, and this was already heavily negotiated, very sophisticatedly structured. Given the scale of the portfolio, even within that, we could identify somewhere around $27 million of annualized savings. And given the scope, the client got something like a 42x return on investment. So again, very tangible results, very quick results, and often, in fact, everything ends up significantly self-funding.
Okay, so we're going to jump into questions here. Amy, before we do that, why don't you talk a little bit about how we help clients in these kind of situations?
Sure, yeah, and we appreciate everyone joining today, and I see a lot of really good questions. I hope we can make time to get to most of those. So a lot of people may not be familiar with Everest Group and how we help on the enterprise side. We have a variety of ways. We're actually incredibly flexible compared to some of the firms I'm aware of, in that we have full-scale consulting services, but then on the research side, we offer both memberships and projects. Some of the memberships are pricing as a service, which is more of an on-demand access to price and performance analytics. So really looking at your contracts, your terms, your pricing on an ongoing basis, keeps it fresh, keeps it top of the market, and that's a great way to drive spend savings across a variety of outsourced categories. We also have the strategic outsourcing and vendor management program, which is where we work with sourcing, category managers, vendor managers to access our research, as well as give expert guidance and advice from our analyst team. We have about 170 or more analysts focused specifically on global services and outsourcing, and continuously reviewing vendors, providers, providing insights and trends and advice. And that's a great way to access that to get the most value out of those relationships and make good sourcing decisions. We also have a global business services membership, which is great if you've got a shared services or GBS organization. On the project side, this is really just a sample of the types of projects we do. We do things that can be, near-term cost takeout, medium-term optimization, cover, very targeted, or cover your complete operating model. So anything from, a quick price benchmarking, or looking at sourcing waste, or skills of the future, rationalizing the portfolio providers, up to longer term workforce strategy and work from home playbook, and really the opportunities are endless there. But worth talking about today is a lot of people are trying to figure out how to get good value for your budget. And I really think that Everest Group offers some very good economical, high return, high ROI projects like Abhishek just talked about.
Yeah.
So with that, we'll wrap up. Sorry, go ahead, Michael, and we can go on.
I was going to say, and I think there's no question that we are the gold standard when it comes to the depth and breadth and the content from an outsourcing and services standpoint. So happy to have you, happy to talk to you. So there are pages and pages and pages of questions here, and we're not going to be able to get to them in the 3 or 4 minutes that are left here. Let me just pick on 1 or 2 of them here, and we will try to answer those in a one-to-one follow-up here. Here's one from, well, I'll just say, here's the question. Is it possible to implement these pointers given the situation where all service providers are hungry for business? And is it possible to get these things? Absolutely. These are, you have to go in with the broader mindset that it's a give and take relationship conversation. It's not just a, hey, just give me, as Abhishek said in the very beginning, it's not just, hey, reduce my rates by 15%, cut my bill by 15%. It's not that. If you go in with that attitude, it's not going to get you what you want. Okay. Then people are going to start to look at it and say, well, it's kind of what we said, squeezing the balloon there. So the implications will be not what you want in the long term. Sure, you can maybe be able to force the hand for it, but the service provider is going to have to do something to make money, and so they will look to other ways to gain that profit back. So our suggestion is look at the real underlying economics that are driving it. If it's if it was originally a labor takeout, labor savings, cost takeout to a low cost location, maybe it's time to reconsider the fundamental underlying conditions of, well, the ultimate labor arbitrage is going to be automation. So if you can help change the process or the underlying conditions that pins the economics of the deal, then you have something that can be a win-win. And yes, you can get 15%. Yes, you can get 20%. But it's not as simple as just, hey, give me my money back. Abhishek, did you see any questions there you wanted to answer?
Yeah. There's one around how to effectively introduce new skills in an existing contract without paying the exclusivity premium in year 2 or 3 of a managed service deal, right? So again, to keep the conversation really balanced, right, for both sides. If it's actually a skill which was somehow either not factored in or not considered while solutioning, and the requirement has come in, asking for everything to be just baked into the existing fee may not be fair, right? Having said that, it's important also, it's very prudent to make sure what really the fair fee for that particular skill is, right? What's that premium? Is it 10%? Is it 5%? Is it 20%? Is it 40%? It has to be calibrated to market norms. Just simple bluster or saying, oh my God, I cannot find this skill anywhere in the whole of the United States, just doesn't do it. It has to be calibrated to the market, right? That's one. And secondly, as it fits into a managed services fee, some kind of back calculation to understand, how many of those skills are required, what's the effort required, and I think that's how it should go up. So again, will it go up? Yes, it should. Should it go up, so substantially or without any checks and balances? No, right? So that calibration has to be done.
All right, so we always want to end on time here. There's a couple slides in the back of the presentation, and yes, there will be a link sent to you where you can download the presentation. Absolutely, that will happen in the next day or so. You can check out our blog there for a number of conversations. There's also a lot of related content on our website. One of the folks that always like to get into is our price book, which is part of one of the offerings that Amy was suggesting. When we close out this webinar, there will be a bit of a post webinar survey. In there will be an opportunity to actually put in your choices for the roles that you're interested in and the countries that you're interested in. So if you would actually take that would actually cut down the number of interactions back and forth to understand what you're looking for on terms of the actual roles and countries for the price check. So if you want to do that, that would help. And if you didn't click the button earlier, you can still do it there as well. So with that, we thank you and are here to help you in any way that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you to Amy, Abhishek, and Michael, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, you will receive a follow-up email within 1 to 2 business days with a link to download the presentation slides, along with accessing the on-demand playback of today's live session. On behalf of Everest Group and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.